Alright guys, so in this video, I'm going to be giving my breakdown on the infamous United Airlines Flight 93 that was hijacked. It was originally a domestic scheduled passenger flight that took off from Newark International Airport and was on track to be headed to San Francisco, California before reversing course. After the hijackers took over, the passengers realized the situation. It ended up veering off course and crashing into a field in Stone Creek Township, Somerset County, Pennsylvania. And we're going to be talking about why this happened. Why was this one different than the other three? It didn't reach its destination. It all has to do with delays to this flight. That was the main reason, as this flight was already 42 minutes behind schedule when it left the runway at 8:42 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The hijackers' decision to wait an additional 46 minutes to launch their assault meant that the people being held hostage very quickly learned that the attacks had already been made by hijacked airlines onto the Twin Towers, as well as the Pentagon in Arlington County, Virginia, near the District of Columbia. 29 minutes after the original hijack had begun, at around 9:57 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the passengers retaliated in an attempt to take control of the aircraft. The uprising and subsequent fight for control of the aircraft lasted around 6 minutes before the terrorists nosedived the plane into a field near a reclaimed strip mine near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, around 20 minutes before it would have reached the National Capital Region of the United States. One person did witness the impact from the ground, and news agencies began reporting on the event within an hour. United Airlines Flight 93 was the fourth and final passenger jet to be taken over by the terrorists on 9/11, and the only one that did not reach its intended target due to the original around 42-minute delay, which enabled the passengers to have the time and the understanding. Also, you had the factor that the terrorists on this plane waited and delayed significantly longer than the terrorists on the other three plane. You can see this plane changing course right over Cleveland, Ohio before tailing off. You can see that little 6-minute window in the flight map where the plane veers off course. They were headed right for DC, and there was a struggle within the cockpit which forced it to veer to the left. They started rocking the plane back and forth. There's been several movies on this that do a really good job of depicting what happened on Flight 93 before it did crash in a random field in Pennsylvania. The only positive thing that came out of that was that it was a completely unpopulated area, meaning there were no additional civilian casualties on the ground from the large plane impact and the crash site that it created. Now, when it comes to the hijackers, they were all seated in first class, and the aircraft involved in the hijacking was a Boeing 757 delivered to United Airlines in June of 1996. It had only been in service a little over 5 years. The airplane had a capacity of 182 passengers, but for this flight, thankfully, it was very sparsely filled. Now, as for the timing of Flight 93 in comparison to the other hijacked airplanes, the three other hijacked flights all departed within 15 minutes of their scheduled times. By the time Flight 93 became airborne, Flight 11 was within 4 minutes of crashing into the North Tower, and Flight 175 was being hijacked. The terrorists aboard Flight 77 had not yet made their move, but were 9 minutes away from storming the cockpit. By 9:02 a.m., less than 1 minute before Flight 175 hit the South Tower, Flight 93 reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. So this was all happening on a delay, basically. This was the one flight out of the four that was delayed, and while the other hijackings had either already happened, were in the process of happening, or were about to happen, this plane was behind schedule, which in essence allowed the passengers to phone on the ground and understand the event, the fact that they were not going to be living because this was a wide-scale terrorist attack and they needed to take the plane down immediately. And that's the main reason I would say why it ended up crashing in a field in Pennsylvania. The initial cockpit breach happened at 9:28 a.m., by at which point Flights 11 and 175 had long since crashed into the World Trade Center. The North Tower had been burning for nearly 42 minutes and the South Tower for the past 25. The only other plane still in the air was Flight 77, and it was within 9 minutes of striking the Pentagon. The hijackers on those flights had waited no more than half an hour to take over the aircraft, most likely striking after the seatbelt sign had been turned off and the cabin services had begun. It is unknown why the hijackers on Flight 93 waited 46 minutes to storm the cockpit, and the thought process behind the delay of the attack was mainly there was just hesitation within the hijackers that would they actually go through it. There was some nervousness, and that was probably the main cause of the delay of, I would say, about an extra 20 minutes, opposed to the other hijackings that took place right after the seatbelt sign had been turned off. Soon after Flight 93 was hijacked, passengers and crew began making phone calls to officials and family members starting at around 9:30 from air phones and mobile phones. Altogether, the passengers and crew made 35 air phone calls and 2 cell phone calls from the flight. 10 passengers and 2 crew members were able to connect, providing information to family, friends, and others. The degree of communication with the outside world was yet another contrast from the other 3 hijackings, where no more than 2 or 3 hostages were able to get in touch with contacts on the ground, and that is how they were able to learn. Now, we're going to talk about the plane actually crashing into the field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and there are a few different questions that people have about Flight 93 and the whole thing. Number one, based off of the time frame from the initial first flight being hijacked to Flight number 93 flying over Pennsylvania with basically all the United States government understanding, or at least all of the high-up people understanding that that plane had been hijacked, it is coming somewhere within the District of Columbia area. We're not exactly sure if they were going for the White House or the U.S. Capitol. People seem to think probably the U.S. Capitol if they want more casualties, but we really don't know. I mean, they did hit the Pentagon, which really, didn't cause very many casualties at all. When the Boeing 757 crashed in Pennsylvania, it had around 6,000 to 7,000 U.S. gallons of fuel remaining, which exploded and released a fireball that scorched the nearby grove. Debris that made up a third of the aircraft, including the cockpit, continued into the woods, demolishing trees on 163 acres. And I actually was able to find an archived story of this days after September 11th. And it really, one of the things I find when researching this stuff, finding articles of the event when it happened right after tends to give you a lot of really good information. People say, oh no, we don't have any perspective on the event, so you want to wait years later. But I mean, this is good details. I saw the flight data recorder was found in a crater the plane created when it slammed into the ground on Tuesday morning. So this was just days later. That's why they were saying on Tuesday morning. This was an article back from 2001. A second debris field was found around Indian Lake, around 3 miles from the crash scene. Some debris was in the lake and some was adjacent to the lake. More debris from the plane was found in New Baltimore, some 8 miles away from the crash. So really, the debris spread out all over everywhere. And that's one of the things you'll get when you look at the crash site in the field in Pennsylvania. One of the big questions, I mean, where's the plane, right? Apparently the plane impacted the ground. It was traveling so quickly, it just completely blew to smithereens and blew all over the place, to the point where at least this article is saying some of the plane parts landed in Indian Lake. And apparently it had a debris field around 8 miles long in total. Now, there are a few photos of bigger pieces, like I think there's a door, there's possibly a window, but really that's it. The plane was completely destroyed because of the speed at which it impacted the ground and the angle it hit the ground at in a nosedive straight down. Police and FBI initially said they didn't want to speculate on whether the debris was from the crash or if the plane could have broken up in midair. So the plane did not break up in midair. Investigators later said the debris was all very light material. Officials said an engine part had been recovered and that much of the debris was tiny And that's really the story you'll get when it comes to that. Now, there is really no photos, initial photos of the crash outside of that one. You guys know the one I'm talking about with the smoke coming up over it. I mean, I'm sure we've all been to the memorial, or at least I went because it was like a field trip or whatever with my school in 7th grade. We went to Shanksville, Pennsylvania in a bus. I think we were going to D.C. and you stopped there on the way back. That place is in the middle of nowhere, the absolute middle of nowhere. So when it comes to nowadays, we think we can just get our phones out, take a high-res pic. They really didn't have that in 2001, especially at where this plane crashed in farmland. You're not going to get a great picture. So there was one person that was able to take a picture of the smoke from the crash, overlooking kind of by a barn there. And then another big question, and this is a question that I had, again, when it comes to the response time of our fighter jets with how close this thing was to Washington, D.C., you'd think they would have been trailing it pretty much the second they caught wind of the flight turning over Cleveland, Ohio, because that is when the hijacking happened. Now, in regards to the fighter jet response by the United States, 2 F-16 fighter pilots from the 121st Fighter Squadron were scrambled and ordered to intercept Flight 93. The pilots intended to ram it since they did not have time to arm the jets. This was in the days before armed jets stood ready to take off at a moment's notice to protect the capital's airspace. They never reached Flight 93 and did not learn of its crash until hours afterwards. So if this is correct, they're basically saying they were going to have to crash their fighter jet into the plane, Prometheus style, to stop it from reaching possibly either the White House or the U.S. Capitol, because they did not have it armed at the time. And because of 9/11, they had to go through another protocol where they had armed jets at the ready. I didn't even know that. So that is crazy. And then obviously there are memorials of it, of course. It is in a field in Pennsylvania. And again, it has to do with 2 different delays. The key thing is the first delay being, and people are wondering, this is another question I wanted to address. People are saying, if they wanted maximum casualties, why not just go on planes that took off at noon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon, because you would have more damage in terms of more people being in the towers and more people being at work. They wanted them all coordinated, all within the same 15-minute span or window. And when you're dealing with air travel and going on 4 different flights, if you have flights take off at 1 o'clock, you're going to be dealing with delays more than likely, especially with those, nonstop East Coast to West Coast type flights. That is why it becomes an issue. And even with them scheduling all the flights earlier in the morning, you still had the problem where this flight was delayed some 35, 40 minutes. And then also that was the first delay. The other delay was with the hijackers waiting an extra 15 to 20 minutes to actually take over the aircraft, probably because of nerves, we would suspect. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you're following me on X. Link to that's always in the description.